Yes, so let's talk about the research realm side of things. So, as soon as you become aware that you might or definitely want to go the PhD in counseling psychology route, you want to start getting involved in research. And there are a few different pieces to that. Typically, the way you start that process, the entry-level position that's available, is being what's called a research assistant, which we abbreviate as an RA. And so typically in your psychology department, as well as some other departments on campus, there will be professors who do psychological research. And they'll sometimes describe themselves as having a research lab. And a research lab might be a physical space where they literally have a lab space where them and their team gather to do research, and maybe if they bring participants in to participate in the study physically, they might bring people into that lab for that purpose. Some other people, their lab, it means like a group of individuals who work together, but there might not be an established physical space other than maybe meeting in the faculty member's office. So lab can mean different things, but for some faculty, but not necessarily all faculty, they will do research, and they will do research that involves work with undergraduates and or graduate students. So depending on the type of school that you're at, there may be opportunities for you to work one-on-one with professors, helping them on their research. You might be able to work on one-on-one where, and this is usually later in your career, where they help you with your research, kind of supporting you and helping you think through things. There may be labs where professors take on graduate students because they have a graduate program, like a master's program and or doctoral program in, say, counseling psychology or other kinds of psychology. And they might also have undergraduates who work in those labs. So it can be any sort of combination of these different roles. But you may find that some faculty members aren't involved in research, or the research they do, they don't wish to bring on undergraduates to help with that research as RAs. So it really just depends. And the way you figure that out is by looking at the faculty websites of these people to try and see if they mention, do they have a lab, do they take on RAs, is there an application, are there current openings for RAs, that sort of stuff. You'll a lot of times be able to find that information on their websites, but not everybody lists that. So sometimes you have to send that professor an email and inquire, or look at the larger psychology department homepage to try and see if there's a listing of labs where you can become an RA in. So you just got to do some digging, do some asking around. If you ask, like the department administrative specialist or like a faculty advisor specific to psychology, they would know about who tends to have RA positions and who doesn't, or where to find them. Maybe you have a bulletin board where labs will advertise opportunities to join the lab, or a lot of times there will be a listserv that you can sign up for the psychology department listserv and be sent emails when it comes time for labs to recruit new RAs to the lab. So just stay connected and reach out and ask people around, and you'll eventually figure out who's taking RAs and who is not. Now, there is some strategy when it comes to thinking about whose lab to join and what kind of lab to join. That's not always obvious to new folks.
Okay, so we have talked about a few things in terms of the research domain. One is this idea of getting a research assistantship, an RAship, and in terms of doing that, how to find who is offering an RA position in terms of what professors or what labs, and then we were about to start talking about how to choose one lab over another in terms of what are the things that I should be looking for in a lab experience. Now, this is something that I don't think explicitly gets talked about so much. I think students hear, oh, I know I'm supposed to get involved in research and do an RAship, but I don't really know why or which one is better than another. That's not really talked about too much. So one thing that comes to mind in terms of quality of a lab is that you want to think about what are the things I'm hoping to get out of the experience, and those come in a few different flavors. The first flavor is if you're getting involved in a research lab because you eventually want to apply to graduate school, which will be a lot of people, then one thing you know you need for a graduate school application is usually 3 good letters of recommendation on your behalf. And a typical person to write such a letter is the manager or the professor who's in charge of a research lab that you would do an RAship in. So one thing you would want is, I would want to be able to get a good, strong letter of recommendation from a lab I participate in. Now, one thing you need to know about that is that in order for someone associated with your lab to write the letter of recommendation, you need to have worked with them for a long enough time and in a substantive enough capacity that they'll be able to say substantive things about you. So typically the minimum amount of time that you will have needed to work with someone for someone to feel comfortable writing a letter is 1 semester. So ideally you'll have at least 1 semester of RAship under your belt with that lab before you go asking for that letter. Another thing is, in their letter they're going to talk about what they've seen from you in terms of the quality of your professionalism in your work. And so certainly how you've corresponded interpersonally, how you interact in person, how professional you are, how punctual, how good with email communication, how well can you follow instructions and understand things, how well can you be a team player with other members of the lab, how much initiative do you show in terms of taking on new projects, and then in terms of the things that you're assigned, how well do you follow through on those things, and what is the degree of quality or the attention to detail or the ingenuity or the rigor with which you do those tasks. So certainly you will have had to do a few projects for them so that they have something to talk about in terms of the quality of that. So a letter of rec is one thing that you might hope to get out of a research lab. And no matter which research lab you do, ideally, after at least a semester's time, they'll be willing to write a letter of rec. Though it's nice if you can, if possible, through talking with other students, get a sense of, does this lab have any special rules about when they become willing to write a letter of rec? Because some labs get so many requests for that they have more stringent criteria, like, you need to have worked with us for X long or done these sorts of projects. So it can be good to be aware of that so that when it comes time to ask for a letter, you're not surprised when you don't meet the criteria or you have to do a lot more work for it than people think. I guess one side note that's helpful is sometimes, because letter writers differ in their style in terms of how they go about writing the letter, some letter writers may request that, okay, if you want a letter from me, I'm going to ask you to give me your CV, I'm going to ask you to give me a rough draft of your personal statements that you're tending to submit to these schools so I can see how you're talking about yourself and representing yourself and the kind of programs you're applying for. Some people might ask you to even talk about the transferable skills you believe you demonstrated on the job, and then maybe provide examples of how you did that sort of thing, so that they have the option to draw from those materials that you've given them as inspiration for their letter. And some labs though this is less common, it does sometimes happen, and you need to be aware that some people, I guess, will feel so busy that they'll be like, why don't you go ahead and write the letter yourself, and I'll sign off on it as if it was mine, if I essentially agree with what you're saying, which of course puts you in a very difficult position, because it's kind of weird to write a letter for yourself, and ethically it can feel weird and such, but this sort of thing will happen sometimes, so you need to be aware of that possibility. So we've talked about the fact that a letter is one thing you might want to get out of your RA experience. Another thing is the type of research skills that you will learn and practice. And these research skills come in a variety of forms, and I'll kind of mention some of the basic skills that you might possibly pick up in a given lab. And so hopefully you're picking up several of these. And when you're working in multiple labs across time, hopefully you're getting a critical mass of these, or many of these pieces along the way. So I'll kind of talk about these skills in terms of where they come into play throughout the research cycle for a given project. So of course, any project starts out with a conceptualization phase, which is where the researchers brainstorm what they want to study, what topic and what specific research questions within that topic. And so the way that conceptualization is done, it's a combination of bringing creative thought to a given research area, and it also requires knowing what has been published already on that topic. Because the thing is, you might say, hey, I want to look at the relationship between marijuana use and memory loss. You know, that's really cool, that's really interesting. I bet there could be a good study done on that. But the thing is, if it's a good idea, a lot of times some other researcher has already started to look at it. And so one of the criteria for being able to publish a study in a peer-reviewed journal is that you have to demonstrate, you have to talk about literally in the paper how the project that you did goes beyond what's been done so far. Because you can't just repeat. Psychology as a field is not so hot on pure replication studies where we redo an exact study that somebody has already done. We're not so hot on that. So you typically, with your studies, got to do something new, add incrementally to the literature. So you will talk about in your paper, here's how this project substantively goes beyond what's been done before. And if you can't demonstrate that, then nobody's going to be interested in publishing your paper, generally. So as a part of that, you have to read the most applicable literature related to that topic. And so in order to know what you need to read or how much there is to read, you need to do what's called a literature search, where you use online services like PsycInfo or Google Scholar or EBSCOhost, etc., to search for key terms related to your topic to see what sort of articles come up in the listings, and then read those articles that are most relevant to your study. So for example, if I want to do a new study on help seeking and how help seeking behavior relates to this thing called mental health literacy, then I'm going to do a literature search for terms like mental health literacy and mental health literacy plus help seeking behavior and various combinations. And how a literature search goes is that we have some vocabulary that's known to us. We have certain words that we're familiar with when it comes to studying certain things. So like when I do help-seeking research, I type in help-seeking or help-seeking behavior or help-seeking attitudes. But the thing is, a lot of times in fields like psychology, there are specific terms or related adjectives that are used in the field, and that a new researcher might be less familiar with, okay, what terms are typically used in this field. So for example, it wasn't until a few years in that I learned that a lot of the help-seeking related research is called treatment utilization research in my field. So I learned, hey, they keep using this keyword or this phrase treatment utilization, and this is literature that's relevant to me. So I have to remember to start searching for articles that are related to treatment utilization. So it's this iterative process where you learn about terms as you go, and you read more articles, and then in these articles you see other keywords mentioned and other terms, and so you're like, oh, this is new, I've got to search this. And so it's this iterative process of discovery. And so you're not really ready to start heavily conceptualizing a study until you have at least a basic sense of the literature in a given area. I mean, you need to know basically what is the basics that's been published on this topic, so that you are adding something new. And this applies more generally, where you'll start looking at certain articles, so you look up certain keywords or phrases or terms or authors or whatever in PsycInfo or Google Scholar. You start to read some papers that come up in the listings that seem more relevant, and ignore the papers that come up that are less relevant. And then in reading those papers, of course, in their introductions, they cite other past studies and other probably pretty important works. And so you'll see the paper you're reading cite somebody who published a few years ago and seems to have some good things to say about a given topic, or had a really interesting study. And then you say, okay, what is that study? I need to go find that study myself and read it, so that I can understand what I need to understand about it. And so this goes on, and you keep rereading and checking the reference lists of papers you read and getting articles from those, and it sort of just spirals downward into more and more searching. And the thing is, one question to ask is, how do I know when to stop? And it's usually when you start to run into what we'd call saturation, where when you're starting to read additional articles on the topic, they're sort of citing the same studies you've already seen and read and talking about the same thing. So once there's not so much new stuff that's showing up, and it's like, okay, it seems like I've read a lot of these key studies they've talked about, and I understand these key terms that they're mentioning, and I seem to have a decent handle on what's been published. When you reach that point of saturation, then you're in a much more comfortable position to think about, okay, I have a basic understanding of what has been done in this area and what's not, and therefore, what unique contribution can I plan to make? And so it's with that knowledge that you can look for holes and gaps in what sort of questions and sub-questions in an area have been answered. And so maybe you read a bunch of studies and you're like, okay, they've looked at the relationships between stigma of seeking help and help-seeking attitudes. And so they've studied that a lot, but you know what? They've studied that mostly in the context of white people's experience, but I haven't seen any studies on how that might play out for black people or Asian American people. And so I'm going to do a study that looks to see if that relationship is consistent with what we found when white participants have been sampled. Or, maybe the relationship between stigma and help-seeking attitudes have been studied, but they haven't really looked at the mediators or the variables that account for that causal link between the two variables. So maybe my study will look at the possibility of, say, self-stigma as being a mediator between public stigma of seeking help and help-seeking attitudes. Maybe that mediator is a key thing that we haven't yet discovered and should do a study on. Or maybe I'll look at factors that might moderate the relationship between stigma and help-seeking attitudes such as potentially gender or socioeconomic status or salience of group norms or something like that. So sometimes you can, in a way, expand on what's been done in the past by adding some key components that haven't been considered. And it takes some time to develop a sense of what sort of incremental addition in your study is enough to warrant publication. So how much new stuff do I need to do in this study to be able to justify to an audience and the peer reviewers who will examine my paper and judge whether or not it's fit for publication? You've got to develop a sense over time of how much new stuff do I need to add to this for it to stand on its own and be good enough. But in the earlier parts of your careers, you can look to your mentors to help you get that better sense of when enough is enough. But suffice it to say, towards the beginning, as a part of this conceptualization of your study, you need to engage in the tasks of searching for and obtaining literature by using research search engines like PsycInfo and Google Scholar, and then you need to spend time reading articles and digesting articles and looking for additional literature based on what you've already read. So these are all research skills that any good researcher has and that you as an RA might pick up, because maybe a professor wants to do a new study and they say, I don't know what's been published on this topic. You go ahead and search for articles, find articles, retrieve PDFs of those articles, and put them together in a folder for me so I can read. And they may even ask you to start reading those articles themselves, and maybe you'll do what's called an annotated summary or an annotated bibliography of those articles, where you read an article and your job is to write up say a paragraph summary of that article, where you summarize the key points about, okay, what was it that they studied, how did they study it, and what did they find. So a nice little quick summary that your professor could very easily read to get a sense of whether or not this study is relevant to conceptualizing, and if they may want to cite this study when they actually write up the paper based on the project they're about to do. So you might do annotated summaries, or you might create an outline of key points in these articles. Another thing that's even more advanced, and this usually happens only once you've had a bit of experience as an RA and you're ready for more intense tasks, is that you do a research synthesis where you're tasked with reading multiple articles on a given topic and writing up a sort of report or summary or paper on this topic. So for example, in the past with a research assistant I work with, had them do a research synthesis on mental health literacy. It was a construct I was unfamiliar with, and so I said, find all the literature that's relevant that you can on mental health literacy, read it all, and put together a report summarizing what do we know about what is this thing, how would we define it, what has research found about it, all these kind of sub-questions related to this construct. And so they would say, okay, we found this, this, and this, and here are the studies that found this piece, and here are the studies that found that piece. So we kind of know where all this different stuff is coming from. That is very similar to writing a review of the literature in an area, which is a key piece of what researchers will do when they're writing up a paper. Because any introduction to a paper, you have to talk about, okay, what are the key articles that have been published in this area that set up the frame for my current study. So that's a more research synthesis, and writing that up is a more advanced task that's a great experience to have if you want to be applying for graduate school and want to talk about skills that you have. So far we've talked about some of these key research skills that you hopefully might pick up from being an RA, which is finding and retrieving literature, doing annotated bibliographies or summaries of them, maybe doing a synthesis of that research or writing a literature review for a project. And then with that stuff, you might be able to engage in conceptualizing a study. And so maybe you would do that in a lab meeting with the professor where people talk about ideas for a study and how to approach it and brainstorm different angles that you might take on that study. So that might be participating in conceptualization of a new project. And so once a project has been fully conceptualized, and I should mention too that a lot of times what happens is you'll read some literature because you'll have a topic in mind, you'll read a little bit of literature to get a very bare sense of what's been done, and then you do a little conceptualization. You say, okay, based on this little I've read so far, maybe we could do things like this. And that would be interesting, but I have to read a little bit more to see if this new little burgeoning idea I have is a good one or a not so good one. And so you'll read a little bit more, and then you say, oh, actually they've kind of examined this piece, so I got to do a little bit differently, so maybe I could do this instead. And then you read a little bit more literature to see if that's been done. So it's this iterative process usually where you kind of go back to that, reading the literature throughout the process. That's normal. But once you've conceptualized the study enough that you've been able to map out the basic design, you've been able to figure out, okay, what general questions do I want to ask? What instruments do I want to include? Or, what sort of data am I going to collect? Is it going to be self-report instruments? Or is it going to be observation of participant behavior? Or what is the data that I'm going to measure in terms of my independent variable and my dependent variable? Those are things that you're going to want to have to nail down. And then what's my basic study design? Is it going to be a survey or an experiment or a quasi-experimental design or a qualitative study based on focus group data or an individual interviews? So all of this needs to get figured out. And then once you figure it out, then the next step is you need to obtain institutional review board approval. Institutional review boards are typically abbreviated IRBs. So if you hear your professor talking about IRBs, that's what they're referring to. It's every institution where research happens at that university has to have an IRB where they review potential studies that people at that university might do and make sure that the studies follow ethical and legal guidelines in terms of the protection of human subjects or protection of animal subjects or whatever. So whenever you want to do anything, you have to basically explain to the IRB, here's how we're going to do the whole study. Does this sound okay with you all? And then they approve it or ask questions or ask for modifications or whatever. So it's one thing that people have to do. So as a part of the lab, it's possible that as an RA, you might help with putting together the IRB application. So that's a research skill that everybody needs to learn at some point, and maybe you'll be able to help out with that. Now, once you obtain IRB approval, then it's time to conduct the study. And so depending on the study design, there's a few different ways that could look. So for me, for example, my research is mostly self-report surveys where I ask people to complete a series of questions, usually short answer or multiple choice or Likert type questions, and that's how I measure certain variables as a part of this survey, written survey or online survey that people complete for over the course of 5, 10, or 15 minutes. So if that's the type of study design that you're using, the next task, once you have IRB approval, is actually creating the survey, putting it together. So that might mean if you're doing an online survey, which is kind of standard these days, we're doing less and less pencil and paper stuff. But if you're doing an online survey, then that means that you have to create that survey in whatever survey program your lab uses, which these days is usually Qualtrics. In the past, SurveyMonkey was used. Some more medical researchers will also use RedCap. So there are different survey programs that you'll see out there, and you need to recreate the survey in that program and make sure it's looking correctly and coded correctly. So you as an RA might be tasked with creating that or helping to create that. Though of course there's a lot of responsibility there because you want it to be correct, so you'll probably have your work checked up on by the person. So that's typically the next thing. If you were doing an experimental study, then you have to come up with a protocol of how you're going to walk participants through each part of the process. So from the time they show up to the lab, and then the sorts of things you have them do or experience or see or hear or taste or smell, you have to have all that planned out up through how you're going to debrief them at the end of the study. So when it comes to experimental research, usually in research labs that employ RAs, the professor or the lab manager or the grad students who work for the professor will be tasked with teaching the undergraduate RAs how to be research assistants in the context of that project. So we call this how to run participants. We use that phrase, run participants, or conduct the study protocol. So you need to know how to walk participants through this protocol in terms of the things to say to them and how to obtain informed consent and how to present the stimuli to them, all of those things. So you need to learn, it's almost like being an actor in a play sometimes, and that you need to learn what things to do at each point. So you might list on your curriculum vitae, I ran participants through a study protocol. That might be a skill that you have, and of course having that skill is important if you want to do your own research later. You need to have a sense of, okay, how do you train people, how do you train your research team to run participants through the protocol, how do you set up a protocol that you can teach people on. All of those things are aspects of the process you become more familiar with by being an RA who's exposed to seeing how that plays out. And so once you've set up the protocol and you know how you want to do that, or you've set up the survey and that's all organized, then you need participants. And so depending on the population that you're sampling from, a variety of things could happen. For example, for some professors, they just need any old person above age 18 to participate in the survey study. So they might be interested in getting what's called a convenient sample. It doesn't really matter. We don't have to measure from one specific population systematically. We just need warm bodies to fill the seats, so to speak. And so a lot of times these convenient samples are collected online. So maybe your professors will task you with looking across the World Wide Web for websites where you can advertise the study, or forums where you can post an announcement about the study, or listservs, or social media outlets, or you basically can spread the word about, hey, we're doing this study, please come participate. And maybe you've set up like a gift card drawing, or you're going to pay participants, or there's a raffle, or whatever. Sometimes there's an incentive that you're going to compensate participants with, to incentivize them to participate, because some are not interested in doing this studies unless they have some sort of incentive or some sort of possible reward beyond them participating out of the goodness of their heart, which some people are willing to do. So you have to recruit participants. Helping to recruit participants is an activity you might be involved in with a lab. So maybe you're hunting down participants online. If you're in a psych department and your professor just uses people from the subject pool, so the students who get extra credit in 100 and 200 level classes for being research participants in professor studies, then you might just organize the SONA system or whatever it is to set it up so that people can sign up for your study through the subject pool and complete it. So that might be another way that you recruit participants. So there can be all sorts of ways that participant recruitment occurs. So yeah, you might therefore get experience with recruiting participants and running them through the protocol. And then the next skill involved in research is then analyzing the data, because once you've collected a good enough sample, then it's time to analyze that data. And data analysis comes in multiple steps. So first you have to clean or prepare the data, which can involve taking care of missing data in some way, checking that the assumptions of the analyses you're going to run are met by the data. So for example, looking at things like the linearity of the relationship between two variables, looking at the homoscedasticity of two variables, looking at the skew and kurtosis of variables to see if they approximate a normal distribution, which is an assumption of many parametric statistics. Looking at things like that, you need to check. And then there are certain things you can do about non-normal distributions and other things like that to better prepare your data for analysis. You might even do some basic descriptive analyses where you're basically tasked with looking at the frequency of responses on a variable across the different levels of the variable, looking at mean, median, range, things like that, standard deviation. So looking into the basics of how people responded to these variables might be something that your professor would ask you to do as an RA, is look into these basic descriptive statistics. They might even ask you, if you feel prepared, if, say, part of your research questions are answered by comparing groups of people on a given dependent variable, then you might be doing independent sample t-tests to compare groups to see if there's a significant group difference. Or they might have you run basic Pearson zero-order correlations to see what kind of linear relationship there is between two variables. So they might ask you to do some basic statistics. And then if you're a whiz, it's possible that they might ask you to do something fancier than that, but oftentimes not. And sometimes they might sit down with you and show you how they're going about doing certain fancier analyses for the paper, but it really just depends on the style of the instructor and the structure of the lab and what kind of mentoring there is. But so that next step is you might be involved in doing some basic data analysis for a project. Once you've analyzed the data, then you're usually in a position to start writing up the study itself. Now, writing a manuscript, writing an article is, I think, the hardest skill to learn when it comes to research. It's the hardest thing to do well, and it takes years and years to get better and better at it. I'm still learning. I'm 9 years into this field, and I'm still learning how to write well. And it can oftentimes be difficult as an undergraduate RA to be able to participate in the writing of a manuscript, simply because it's such a hard skill to learn and practice. And a lot of times people are not really ready to start doing that task until they've reached a graduate level of education or in graduate school as a master's or a doc student, and can work more closely with the professor on writing up something. And of course, you're ideally getting experience as an undergraduate in certain classes by writing a research paper and learning how to do that. So that's good, and maybe that's preparing you to be able to contribute to the writing of a manuscript. But oftentimes, the extent of the writing that you might do related to a project is creating those annotated bibliographies or finding that literature, which then other people who have more advanced skill sets will then use those materials to write up a given paper where they introduce the study, discuss the methods used, describe the results, and then discuss the implications and the meaning of those results. And then not only do people write up a manuscript for publication in a peer-reviewed journal, but something that's simpler and happens earlier often is they create a poster or a brief conference paper for a conference that they submit for consideration at a conference. So, say the American Psychological Association, they have their annual convention every year in August. And as a part of this, you can submit your study, you can submit an abstract, 300 to 500 words, describing the study you have underway or preliminary data you have. And then the conference organizers and the reviewers can look over that abstract and say, hey, we think this is interesting enough that you deserve to be able to present this poster during a poster session at the convention. Or maybe you have a paper that you want to present alongside other colleagues as a part of a symposium, which is basically a 50 or 2-hour presentation on a single topic where different people have different projects that they'll talk about for, say, 12 minutes each, projects related to this topic. So, like this upcoming APA, I'm going to present a paper on measurement of spirituality amongst atheists, whereas my colleagues who are also presenting in the same symposium are talking about other measurement of spirituality issues. So slightly different topics, but all under this larger topic of spirituality measurement. So that was what we would call a symposium. And it's usually hard to figure out a way to have your work as a student be featured in a symposium, because that requires knowing colleagues and coordinating with someone to put together a larger symposium. It's usually easier to submit an abstract requesting your ability to present a poster. And a poster is just a 3-foot by 5-foot large piece of canvas or material where you describe briefly each aspect of the project, whether it's something underway or in preliminary data analysis or fully complete. This poster is this brief snapshot description so that a person walking by during the poster session can glance at your poster and learn some key information about the study very quickly. And then if they want, they can strike up a conversation with you and ask you to explain more in depth what exactly you did for the study or clarify certain things that they see written on the poster. So doing a poster presentation or presenting a paper at a symposium or things like that, these are pretty basic presentation experiences. And again, one key skill that all researchers need is practice presenting research. And so that's usually done at meetings of various kinds. And there are different kind of levels of presentation that can occur. You have local conferences, you have university conferences, you have regional conferences, you have national conferences and international conferences. So for example, I've been to an international conference, the International Counseling Psychology Conference that happens every 5 years or so. I go regularly to the national conference, which is APA's annual convention that happens usually somewhere in the country. And then I've also been to regional conferences like the Midwestern Psychological Association. That's often a great place for younger students to present. And then I've been to local conferences, so conferences held at, say, Iowa State University, where people at the university were welcome to present their research there. And sometimes even departments, like the psychology department at your school, may have a conference that they put on where the undergraduate students can present their stuff. And so how this typically goes is when you're involved in research, you ideally want to get experience in presenting this research that you're involved in. And so as a younger student, it's usually easiest and least competitive to get your poster accepted to a more local conference because there's less competition and the quality of the project doesn't have to be as rigorous usually because there's less competition. So you usually start by presenting research you're involved in at local conferences, and then maybe you graduate to then submitting and presenting at a regional conference, and then ideally you climb up to the national APA convention, or if you're in certain areas you're doing you're doing APS, American Psychological Society. So some sort of national conference. Harder to get into, higher quality research you're competing against, but looks even better on your CV. And again, one of the key criteria that professors look for when they're considering what applicants for a PhD program they want to bring on, they'll look at your presentations and publications. And as a young scholar, it's usually hard to have any peer review publications on your record. That's usually unrealistic unless you got lucky and were able to be a part of the project where you were a second or third author or whatever on a paper that got accepted to a peer-reviewed journal. Usually what's more realistic is you'll be involved in your professor's research and they'll say, yeah, you're welcome to present on this project to some sort of conference. I'll help you put together the poster based on this research that you can then present. So RAs will get a chance to get some stuff on their CV, get some presentations on their CV by working with their professor or grad students or other undergraduate students in the lab to put together this brief poster that describes a study that they're working on, and then submitting that abstract describing briefly what the poster will look like to a conference committee, and then hopefully if they say, yes, this is good enough, congratulations, we've accepted, you may present your poster at our conference. Then you get to add that to your resume and you get that experience of standing in front of your poster at the conferences and practice describing the study and just learning how to do that whole thing, having a dialogue about research with another interested professional. So that is another key skill, is learning to present research. And as I was saying before, it's a rare opportunity to be able to help with the writing of the manuscript of the paper itself, since that's a very hard thing to do and it requires a lot of basic experience and training before you're ready to write up something useful that can make its way into the manuscript. And sometimes how it works with papers is usually once a paper is written up and the professors are about ready to submit it to a journal for consideration and peer review, a lot of times RAs can help out with proofreading that polished paper, or RAs can help out with creating the reference list or fixing the in-text citation. So when I write papers, for example, I have a little shorthand for my in-text citations where I just mention the first author's last name and the 2-digit year in the parentheses next to the piece of information that I'm citing. And then I will go back later and formally write out the entire citation. It just makes rough drafting the paper easier. And then I will ask one of my research assistants to go through and clean up those in-text citations and then look through my literature collection, which I've given them a copy of since it's all electronic, and I ask, hey, look through these in-text citations and please build a reference list so that everything I cite in the text has a reference list entry. So that's a simpler task that an undergraduate research assistant can very realistically take on. So oftentimes you can have experience as an RA in helping with in-text citations, proofreading papers, looking for grammatical and spelling errors and other APA style incongruencies, and creating or checking a reference list. So those are other activities that you can usually have exposure to. So those are some of the big pieces of the research cycle, because every project goes through a cycle like that. I should mention too that if you're helping a professor out who does qualitative research, then you might be transcripting audio tapes into written transcripts so that they can be analyzed properly. Alternatively, you might be coding them for certain themes or looking through pieces of text for certain topics or concepts that are mentioned. Typically, that sort of more advanced analysis of the text would require that your professor or the coordinator would teach you the process for doing that coding and analysis of those written transcripts, but that is something you might also be able to help with. In terms of other things that you might possibly help out with that can occur at various points in the cycle or on certain projects, if you're helping a professor out with a scale development paper, for example, they might ask you to help them generate potential items for the survey measure, or to critique or check those items for clarity or comprehensibility, as well as looking over the instructions for that perspective scale to see if they make sense. If they're doing survey research using something like Mechanical Turk, which is a online marketplace where people are paid small amounts to participate in various tasks, such as survey research, then you might be in charge of coordinating that data collection through that platform. Similar if you use a research registry or your professor uses a research registry, then you might coordinate the collection of participants through that registry. When it comes to the articles that you might download for a professor, perhaps you would be tasked with organizing those articles into different folders by topic, or renaming and cleaning up those PDFs for them. And sometimes with some professors who collect survey responses on paper, what you will have to do is spend time entering those on-paper survey responses into Microsoft Excel or SPSS database program, things like that. So, in summary, I've just talked about various tasks that I'm aware of that undergraduate research assistants might help a research lab out with. And you might be asked to do one of these things your whole time in the lab, or a few of these things. It just really depends on the needs of the lab and the nature of the lab and the professor, and how much it's about getting labor out of you as an RA versus creating a training and a mentoring experience for you. So it's good for you to be aware of what I've just mentioned in terms of these are some of the things that you might want to get exposure to, ideally, because it helps you learn about the various pieces of the research cycle. And so when you're, to bring us way back to why I started down this path, when you're looking for a research lab experience, you want to think about, okay, what have I had exposure to so far, and what things
would I like to get additional exposure to? So if you have been in a lab where you spent most of your time entering data for that professor, and so you know that really well, then perhaps with your next lab, your next RAship, you might want to do something different with your time. And so when you interview for the lab or talk with the person who might hire you on, you're able to talk through, okay, what are some of the typical things that you ask RAs to do as a part of your lab? And you can listen to what they say. And if it sounds good to you what they mention, then you can go ahead with that. But if they say, oh, we'll have you do X, Y, and Z, but you have already had plenty of experience doing X, Y, and Z and would really like to branch out and expand your skills in other domains, then maybe this lab isn't such a good fit and you might want to consider going somewhere else for that experience. Again, if you have the option and the choice to do so. So these are some of the considerations that you can have in mind. Now that we've talked about some of the different things you might do in a lab, it's also important to talk about degrees of complexity of these tasks and what you want to see for yourself. So, as you might guess, when you're starting out getting familiar with research as an undergraduate, you're really only qualified to do the most simplest of tasks because you need to learn the simple foundational things before you can build on that and start taking on more difficult, advanced, complex tasks. So it's very appropriate earlier on when you're first starting to do research lab experiences to be satisfied with doing some of the simpler things. But you want to bear in mind that as you start to get familiar with some of the simpler things and you're getting more experience in research labs and you're taking more advanced classes like the research methods lab and the statistics lab and other things, as your competence and skill set grows, you want to then start to take on more complex tasks in the stuff that you're doing, because you don't want to get stuck in a dead-end job doing the same tasks over and over again. You're not expanding yourself. That won't help you prepare to be a very strong candidate for graduate school. Instead, after doing some of those basic tasks and feeling comfortable with them, I advise you to speak with the lab coordinator or the professor and explore potential opportunities for taking on different tasks to expand your skill set and more advanced tasks. So for example, maybe you started out collecting and searching for articles and PDFs of articles for the professor. And maybe the next step up would be offering to summarize those articles that you've collected, writing annotated bibliographies or annotated summaries of those articles. And so you might get some practice doing that, and that takes a while getting used to and requires some practice. But then after getting a good chunk of experience with that, maybe the next step up, level 3, would be moving on to doing a research synthesis or a literature review where you're summarizing what's been found out about a construct or a topic across multiple studies. And what is the gestalt, what's the overall thing that we've learned about a given area based on several studies that have been done on it. That's more advanced, it's tougher, it requires more critical thinking, more familiarity with the research, more comfort with reading research articles and being able to think in terms of that sort of technical, precise language. So it's this building on foundational experience and getting more complex that ideally you want to do. And so knowing that that's something you want to do over the course of your later undergraduate years, you want to try and plan your research lab experiences so that you get increasing exposure to those advanced tasks. And there's a few kind of principles that can help you get at that. One is, if you spend more than a semester in a given lab, then you start to be able to give that professor or lab coordinator a sense of who you are. So if you're in a place and you keep your head down and you do good work and you're conscientious and you're professional, then the professors will see, okay, they've mastered this basic stuff. They're doing well with this basic stuff. I feel comfortable giving this person a more advanced task that requires more responsibility. And so you can then scale up because you've built trust in a relationship with them, and they know that it's worth giving you an advanced task because they can trust you to take that on and seek consultation from them when maybe you're confused or need clarification on that task, like I mentioned earlier in the recording. So ideally, by staying in a given lab, you build rapport and you can start to do more advanced things in that lab over time. Another thing is if you have been in a lab and getting some experience and you want to branch out and move on up, then you might approach a second lab and say, hey, these are some of the basic skills that I have gotten experience with so far. I'm looking for more exposure to these more advanced skills or these other skills over here. Does that seem like it might be a good fit for your lab? Do you have need of an RA who would attend to these sorts of projects or would do these sorts of tasks on behalf of the lab? So you can kind of shop around and see if there's a lab that would give you the opportunity to engage in some of those more advanced things. So those are some of the ways you can think about how can I move up in terms of the complexity of tasks that I'm taking on. Now, so far in my discussion of the things you're doing as a part of the lab, I've very much talked about how you are helping somebody else with their research. The professor themselves, one of the professor's graduate students, a fellow more advanced undergraduate student, whatever it is, you're supporting somebody else in a support capacity as an assistant. But as you might have heard, at some point, it's really good if you can start to take the lead on a project of your own, where you're what we would call first author, or you're the principal investigator on the project, where you're doing most of the work in moving the project forward. That's also another more advanced role that ideally you can move into as an undergraduate. So I will say a little bit more about what that looks like and how the typical trajectory is. So ideally, let's say in your sophomore or junior year, you get involved in your first research lab and you get in about a year into that lab doing good work for them, and it's always a good idea to get involved in at least one other lab so you also are building experience in a second lab. And then once you have some of the groundwork exposure to basic skills in those labs and maybe have taken on some medium complexity projects, at that point you can start to think about opportunities for doing an independent study or a senior thesis or a capstone project, where it's different in that somebody's not saying, okay, you take on this smaller piece of this project that I'm delegating to you, but you are the leader in a way on a paper. So that usually means either the professor is giving you some data that they have, and your task is to think of a hypothesis that you can test with that data, and then analyze it, and then write it up, and hopefully present it as a poster, or write it up as a manuscript that you might try and submit to a peer-reviewed journal if you're really advanced, although that tends to be a rarer opportunity. Or other than that, let's see. Or maybe someone's not giving you some ready-made data, but you're truly doing the whole cycle where you say,
hello, professor, I'd like to initiate a project. Would you feel comfortable supporting me in that? Is that something you'd be comfortable with me taking on, where you'd sit down with them and they would guide you? So again, you're doing the brunt of the work, but the professor or the graduate student or whoever is mentoring you is telling you, okay, here's how to approach this next step, or here's some key things. And then you do that work, you follow through on that, but the person is guiding you in terms of the process of what to do next.
So an independent project like that, where you're taking the lead, is the most optimal form of experience. That's the strongest builder of your resume as an undergraduate. So you first pay your dues in a way by helping other people with their stuff, and then once you've earned your keep and you have enough basic skills and you've taken enough classes, then in your junior or probably senior year, you're finally prepared enough and have paid your dues enough that you'll then be in a position to take the lead on initiating your own project, where you think of the idea, do the literature review to help flesh that idea out, facilitate the data collection, take the lead on the analysis, and write up as a poster more likely, or perhaps as a manuscript, what you found. So that's where you want to end up ideally. You want to be involved in that independent project before you have to apply for PhD programs. Because the thing is, the thing that professors who are considering potential PhD students look for is they ask themselves, has this person already demonstrated the capacity to do the sorts of tasks that a graduate student would have to do, that a PhD student would have to do? So if you're already doing the stuff that you'll need to do as a graduate student, then that reassures people that, hey, they're qualified for this, they're kind of doing it already. And graduate school is some part helping other people with their research, but increasingly over time, it is you taking the lead on your own research. So they love to see you taking that initiative already as an undergraduate student. So to reiterate, you start by helping other people out with their research, and then hopefully you start at least one independent project where you're taking the lead on that. And again, there are different possibilities in terms of how an independent project like that could come across, or where you could get the support from it. Because the thing is, you're not going to be able to do this independent project alone. You're not yet qualified. It would be a really rough time for you to try and do it all by yourself. And in fact, you need, when you submit an application for IRB, so that you can get ethical approval from your institution to do that study, you need to have a faculty PhD mentor who's signed off on that project. So you literally cannot do research alone. You need that mentorship officially in place. So the trick is you have to find some sort of qualified mentor who is ready and willing to spend the time helping you out with each step of the research process. And so sometimes that can happen when you've put in a semester or two in a professor's lab, and then they feel good about the work you've done for them, and they might say, hey, you've done good work for me, you're trustworthy, you take good initiative, I feel comfortable allowing you to start your own project, and I'll provide you support and guidance throughout that. So that's one way to do it. In some other ways, perhaps your school, and this is the case often at better schools, in that they'll have an opportunity for students to do like a senior thesis or an independent project where they will have professors lined up who are ready to help supervise or mentor you as you take on that independent study or senior thesis or capstone project. And so in some ways that supervision is put in place and it's a lot easier to get. So it's a good idea to early on when you're in your department figure out, hey, how do people in this department as undergraduates do independent research projects? Who do they need to build relationships with? What sort of structures are in place? Does that happen in the context of a lab, or can you just approach a faculty member and they'll be your advisor? Get to know how that typically happens and how the best undergraduate students get that put together. And then make a plan for getting that hooked up for yourself.
because you want to have that independent project already started, at least, before applying for graduate school. And again, if you work closely with the professor who's helping with you in an independent project, they can say a lot of good detailed things about your capacities as a potential graduate student in their letter of recommendation. So oftentimes the person who's supervising your senior thesis will be somebody who writes one of your letters of recommendation. And the thing is, don't fret so much if your school or how your educational trajectory has been if you won't have the opportunity to do an independent project while an undergraduate. You don't have to. People can still become successful PhD applicants without such an experience. It just raises you above the competition, and it's increasingly a thing that you'll want to do to seal your chances of being able to get into a PhD program. So that, I think, addresses that topic pretty well in terms of over time you want to be taking on more advanced projects and you want to be taking on more independent projects where you're increasingly taking the lead and the initiative on things. And I should mention too that depending on how a given research lab is set up, you may have the chance to work closely or sometimes with the actual professor. Sometimes you'll only be working with a graduate student or graduate students who work with that professor in the context of the lab, or sometimes another advanced undergraduate student who's moderating you. And of course, ideally, if you have a choice between working with a professor directly and a graduate student, it's better to be able to work with the most senior person, with the professor themselves, because that represents a stronger letter of rec. And I might have mentioned this earlier, but you want the professor signing off on your letters of recommendation rather than students, because PhD programs want to hear from people who themselves have gotten a PhD and therefore probably know what it takes to get a PhD. They're the most qualified letter writers. So you'll probably want letters from them rather than from a graduate student. Though, as I think I mentioned before, a lot of times if you work most closely with the graduate student in their lab, the grad student will actually be the person to write the letter, but then the professor will sign off on it as if it was them who was writing it. That's a pretty standard practice and is fine, because the graduate student knew your work the best, and the professor is signing off and saying everything this person wrote is true about the undergrad student, so you can take my word for it and my seal of endorsement. And one thing that I think I commented on a little bit, but should do more here, is that when you sign up for a research lab, the people running the lab will often have initial ideas about what sort of tasks they want to have you do. But sometimes there's room for you suggesting things that you might help out with, and if you want to show this transferable skill of initiative, then you might even want to say, hey, I'd love to get more experience with X sort of experience. Might that be possible? Or do you need possibly help with summarizing literature in this area, or writing up a research summary in this area? So by you suggesting things and recommending certain tasks that you might take on, you get to maybe have some say in being able to get experience in new transferable skill areas. And if they say, yeah, that would be a good fit, then it works for everybody. So of course you can only do things that a professor would find useful in the lab, but sometimes you can make suggestions and have those heard. Of course, every lab is different, and in some labs maybe you're told exactly what to do and you're not really making your own destiny. So you'll want to feel that out and talk with other RAs in the lab to get a sense for what's typical. So we've been talking about key pieces in this research domain of preparation for becoming a great PhD applicant. In terms of other more random bits of advice that I would give, one thing that I will say is it's a good idea to attend professional conferences if possible, because this is a place to get exposure to people you might network with, and people who you might be able to apply to their programs possibly.
or people who you might collaborate with on research in the future. It's a great place to see how people present their research, both as posters and as papers, and you can learn from how they do that in thinking about how you can present your own work. And I also found that the first American Psych Association convention that I went to was really transformative for me, because I was able to see the nature and the quality of people's research that they talked about, and I learned that, hey, this stuff doesn't actually seem that complex or difficult. I saw people doing studies that were pretty simple and not that complex, and that seemed to be well received by the audience, and that showed me that, hey, I can do some more simple things. I don't have to be so crazy and complex, and I could basically be in the running with these folks. I could do stuff like this. This isn't so hard. So it really increased my excitement and my self-efficacy about getting involved in research myself. So that's a great sort of experience to have, because prior to that, I was thinking I just want to be a clinician after I graduated with my PhD. But going to conferences really got me excited about the research side of things, and that's one of the factors that eventually helped me want to go the academic route. And so here I am, a professor, doing lots of research as well as teaching and other things. So I recommend going to conferences whenever you can. And you can start with local conferences, because those are easier, but a lot of times your department will have travel funding or awards that you can compete for, where you can get a few $100s to be able to attend, say, the National American Psychological Association convention, because that sort of funding, depending on your financial situation, might be really helpful to get you there. And of course, if you can pay out of pocket too, then that helps. I definitely think going to the APA convention as an undergraduate, say before your senior year like I did, is a great move if you can pull it off. And it gives you a chance to network with graduate students and talk with graduate students who are at various programs and learn about them. And it can be nice to get your face out there as well, so that people who might be looking at your paper application later have met you in person at a social hour or whatnot as an undergraduate, and then they have a face to the name, and if you gave a positive social interpersonal impression, then that can really help your application feel more human and robust to them. So it's just a good idea on many levels to be able to go to conferences if financially you can make it work. In terms of other things, one thing I haven't addressed directly is this idea of being an author on a poster or on a presentation, because there are some rules of the road or implicit norms that you'll probably want to be aware of. So, as you probably guessed, it's great to be able to have on your CV that you've presented a poster or a paper at a conference, or that you've been an author on a manuscript published in a peer-reviewed journal. That's the best. Or a book chapter published in a book, that's kind of second best. Or published in a non-peer-reviewed space like a blog or something like that, that's the third best and kind of a far third. So the more of that you can have on your CV, the better. But there's some things you need to know about that. One is that as an undergraduate student, it's pretty hard to be an author on a published peer-reviewed journal article, because the thing is, there's a certain threshold for what it takes to be an author on a paper. Usually the sorts of contributions that an undergraduate research assistant would make to a given project are more simple tasks, and those simple tasks don't rise to the threshold that justifies being added as an author on a paper. Some professors definitely vary in their opinions on this. So some people will add students as authors for doing comparatively little, or doing these simpler tasks that RAs do. But in general, in my experience, most professors will only give authorship credit to those people who make a substantial contribution to the writing of the paper. That's perhaps the most important criteria that gives you authorship, is did you make a substantial contribution to the writing? So did you draft the introduction, method, results, or discussion section? A substantive draft. Or did you contribute significant revisions to those write-ups? Or did you do a significant part of the research analysis of the data? Those are the sort of tasks that usually justify being added as an author, because they're the hardest things to do. Whereas things like cleaning the data, or obtaining research articles, or even writing an annotated summary of those articles, or proofreading stuff, or creating reference lists, or other things like that, those are more minor tasks, and they don't rise to the level of deserving authorship credit generally, though maybe you'll come across a lucky professor here and there who might give you that credit. So that's something to bear in mind in terms of what justifies authorship order on a manuscript, and that's why it's so hard for an undergrad to get authorship credit, because it's really hard to be able to find somebody who you can work with who's willing to let you take a crack at one of those big tasks, like drafting a section of the paper. And it's really hard because that's a hard skill that typically we don't have as an undergraduate student. But if you find an opportunity to make that happen, where you can do a piece for a project that will justify being added as an author, do that. If it's practical and possible for you, do that, because that makes you automatically a top 10% applicant for a PhD in counseling psych program, is if you can have your name listed as one of the authors on a paper that's being published in a peer-reviewed journal. It's a very excellent indicator of quality and serious involvement in research. So if it's possible, do that. So that's the situation with papers. When it comes to presentations, the bar is much lower, thankfully. And so there's a few different ways you can get a poster. Basically, a poster I've talked about earlier. A poster is pretty easy to create. You can usually take a first crack at creating the poster and get assistance by graduate students or the professor or other people on that poster. So sometimes you and several other people might have worked on putting this poster together. But because a poster is so simple, say 3 or 4 bullet points for each section, that's much easier to write up than a paper. And the standards of quality are much lower for that being accepted to a conference. So it's a great idea to try and, if you're involved in any given project in your research lab, be in communication with the professor or the coordinator about, hey, are we looking to, or is there a possibility of presenting this project that I've been helping with at a convention? And if there is, you want to explore, hey, could I possibly help out with the creation of the poster or the paper that we might put together based on this project? If there's a conference we could submit that abstract to. So that's an excellent opportunity. It's much more realistic to be able to contribute to a poster and get your name listed on it. And at first you might start out where you're a second, third, or fourth author on that poster because you did some of the least amount of work on it. That's fine. Whatever you need to do to get your foot in the door. And then ideally, when you're applying for PhD programs, you want to have at least 1 or 2 first author poster or paper presentations under your belt. So if you can be first author on a poster you presented at a local conference, that's good. If you could present that same thing or something different at a regional conference, that's even better. And then a national or international conference is the best. So if possible, if you can be involved in a project and you're first author on a poster, and so you're doing most of the work, but there's also people who are helping out with that, so fellow RAs, and maybe the professor is third author because they're overseeing the process, then go ahead and put that together and get that submitted to an APA journal if possible. And then a lot of times you can your funding from your university or getting that award is contingent on you presenting something at the conference. So if you're presenting something, people are much more willing to give you money so that you can go to that conference to present. So it's a good idea to submit to the annual American Psychological Association convention if you can, so that you can go there, present the poster, and then you have on your CV this first author presentation. So that's kind of that's the next best thing compared to getting authorship on written manuscripts. And being on posters is much more realistic. And I'll tell you too that if you don't have any presentations, poster or paper conference presentations on your CV, you will look suspect to professors, because that's kind of the basic mark of someone being seriously involved in research, and it's kind of expected that you would have a few presentations on your CV. So really try your best to make sure that happens, because you want that on your CV. So I think that's it on the conference side. So to, I guess, wrap up this research domain section, there are various indicators of your involvement in research, and the more you can have these indicators appear on your CV and the stronger flavors of involvement, the better. So at the most basic level, you want to get involved in 2 research labs, ideally, at least 1 for 2 semesters, so you can do more advanced projects for them, hopefully. So that's the most basic level of showing that you're involved in research, is being an RA in labs and helping out with whatever you're helping out with. The next level, kind of the step up in quality, is having yourself listed as an author on paper or poster presentations on your CV. And again, having more is better, and being closer to first author is better. And then the top tier of quality and the top tier form of evidence that you're serious about research is being an author on a paper published in a peer-reviewed journal. That is the best. It's hard to get as an undergraduate, but if you can, it can really set you apart. So this wraps up talking about the research domain of things, and next we'll speak to the practice side of your preparation to be a great applicant.